The Healthcare Labyrinth podcast is back for another episode. Join Mark S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. My name's Mark Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting the podcast, and thanks to everyone for listening in. We are going to veer off the regular healthcare podcast road today because I do want to respond to some inquiries I've gotten from people that read my blog and listen to my podcast about my views on what Donald Trump has done so far in terms of his assertion of executive authority. So this clearly will have some impact on healthcare because depending on how he asserts his executive authority and things like that, certainly healthcare could be impacted. So it's not exactly totally off what I normally do in terms of talking about healthcare, but nonetheless a slight deviation generated by some inquiries from many of you out there in the listening audience or reading my blog. Some of you do know that I have a background in government, and that's why you asked. And obviously in my news feed, I have been talking a great deal about some of the layoffs and hiring freezes and spending freezes and things like that, as well as in my blogs. I also talk about what possible cuts are out there. And a lot of this does depend on how Donald Trump views himself in the overall system of government between the three branches here. So we will take our normal 3 breaks, break it up into about 4 parts. This one is going to be rather complex, probably a little longer, but this podcast is really how Trump is testing the limits of power by stretching Article 2 of the Constitution. We're in early March right now, so we're about 7 weeks into his tenure. And again, many of you are aware of my service in state government and the executive branch, and you've asked me about the recent controversies about President Donald Trump's broad exercise of executive power in Washington, D.C. So I'll give you my unvarnished and hopefully dispassionate view of things on this. And the question really is, should we feel sympathy for what the executive, in this case, Donald Trump, is trying to do? And is the president going too far? So first, let's talk a little background on me for those who don't know about my government service. I served in state government in Connecticut from 1995 to 2005. I was a Republican executive appointee and eventually became the deputy management secretary and deputy budget director of the state, and then later the management secretary and the budget director. I served about 7.5 years in these 2 appointed posts. Connecticut is a small state, so a great deal of the authority and power is vested at the state level. And the Office of Policy and Management, or OPM as it's known, my office, held great sway over policy, management, and budget in state government at the direction of the governor. In rough measure, OPM is like the Federal Office of Management and Budget, known as OMB. While my boss was in office, the governor, we saw either a split legislature or one controlled by Democrats. My tenure was not without some of the same controversies we see today over the last weeks or so, especially during lean budget times when state budgets can go out of balance. We had executive exercise spending cutbacks, layoffs, and showdowns with the legislative branch. At one point, we as the executive branch ran the government by executive order because of the lack of a budget in place after vetoes of the spending and revenue plan. We unilaterally set expenditure levels at minimum levels. It was a gambit to force the legislature to make reductions to spending levels to keep outlays in line with the anticipated revenues. At the time, the Democratic Attorney General did not challenge the executive branch's authority to do what we did. This ultimately led to a compromise budget being passed. So with that background, let's dive a little deeper into what the U.S. Constitution really says about the branches of government, separation of powers, and checks and balances. Well, oftentimes we talk about what is known as co-equal branches of government. Our history lessons and our political science and civics lessons tell us that we have 3 co-equal branches of government. Well, actually, not really, or at least that was not intended to be the case by the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution. They did want separation of powers and checks and balances. They also did not want to concentrate power in one branch so as to avoid the tyranny that we saw under Britain. But they did not necessarily want co-equal branches of government. The founders used the terminology co-equal back in those days to describe 2 things: the relationship between states and the federal government. They viewed that as co-equal, as well as the relationship between the House and Senate. They viewed the 2 chambers with different types of responsibilities in some cases as co-equal as well. But they never really talked about the 3 branches, the legislative, judicial, and the executive, as co-equal. In truth, the founders intended and wanted the legislative branch, or Congress, to have more power than the other branches. The founders gave Congress the power of taxing and spending. They said that the legislative branch represented the people and would most directly represent their will. In some ways, we can interpret the founders' view on how powerful the 3 branches should be by looking at the order in the Constitution. Article 1 is the legislative branch or Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch or the president. And Article 3 are the courts and the Supreme Court. At the same time, this is not to say that the founders did not want a powerful executive. After the failure of the Articles of Confederation, our first real national document, it was clear that a reasonably powerful executive was important in the founders' mind. In Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton makes the case for a strong, unitary, and singular president. Hamilton makes the case that a strong executive is necessary for a country's survival. So before we take our first break, let's just reflect on that. The founders wanted separation of powers and checks and balances. They also made the leap from a weak centralized government to a more centralized one, and they did want a relatively strong executive to safeguard the nation. But they did not want co-equal branches of government, and they actually intended, at least early on, for the legislative branch to be the more powerful of the 3 branches. With that, we'll take our first break, and we will continue with our review of what has happened over time with the branches and some of Trump's arguments. Be right back.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Mark Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Mark dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage in a private delivery model. Mark is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about Trump's effort to redefine and broaden executive authority within his first 7 weeks of coming to office here. And we promised that now we would get into a further review of what has happened to the branches of government over time and some of Trump's arguments on executive power. So first, what has happened with the branches? Well, over the years, two things really happened. First, Congress increasingly moved some of its power to the executive branch and deliberately empowered it at its own expense. Second, the complexities of governing led to the creation and growth of executive agencies to implement laws and administer government. Let's talk a little bit of Trump's arguments on executive authority. Well, in the past 7 weeks or so, Trump has argued a few things. He believes that the executive branch has or must have more power than has been exercised in the past. He sees this in the Constitution. As well, he has argued that the bureaucracies that emerged in agencies have effectively co-opted power from the executive or president and even the legislative branch, Congress. He argues that no elected officials are truly now in control. He also believes in the concept of a unitary executive. In articulating his second point on the bureaucracy, Trump argues that the founders intended to create what is known as a unitary executive, and that the Constitution vests in him and in him alone executive authority. Trump effectively argues that delegation of authority by Congress, or the executive themselves, to vast swaths of the bureaucracy violates the concept of unitary executive. Trump argues he and the immediate White House should have sole authority to implement laws, conduct government, and hire and fire throughout the executive branch. Again, given complexity and the need for expertise, over the years, strong agencies were built and bureaucracies established. Congress vests power in these agencies when they pass laws to carry out those laws. A civil service emerged as well over time to prioritize competence and accountability rather than political patronage. While agency heads generally are nominated by the president, with some being confirmed by the Senate, Trump would argue too much power has been vested in places over which he does not have direct control. He would argue the civil service has neither promoted competence nor accountability. So what has Trump done so far in his 7 weeks on expanding his executive authority? So it's a pretty big footprint already in just 7 weeks. He has created the Department of Government Efficiency Commission that is looking at spending, hiring, and more in each agency, and actually tasked with freezing spending. He has instituted a wide-ranging domestic and foreign spending freeze, arguing it was needed to review fraud, waste, and abuse and ensure efficient operation of government given the debt crisis. He has instituted layoffs and terminations, put in place a job buyout for the roughly 2 million workforce that is civilian, ordered some agencies closed, for example, the Agency for International Development, and removed certain individuals possibly in violation of civil service and other requirements. He has also ordered the 2 million civilian workforce to report back to work by limiting or eliminating most work-from-home provisions. He has issued far-reaching executive orders that change policy and fundamentally shift focuses in the executive branch. And he has also instituted a regulatory freeze and ordered so-called independent agencies in the executive branch to run proposals by the White House first. And last, he is pulling out of a number of international organizations, including the World Health Organization. Courts have weighed in with injunctions in some of these issues, but allowed the executive to proceed in others. For example, the freeze in spending was enjoined, although there is evidence that Trump has ignored the rulings to some degree. In the area of layoffs and the job buyout, courts, though, have given more deference. In the end, Trump is seeking to remake the executive branch by hobbling the bureaucracy, gaining greater control over agencies, centralizing policymaking within the White House, and massively streamlining the workforce. What is the history of executive actions similar to Donald Trump? Well, in truth, presidents of both parties have historically asserted the role of the executive over the legislative. This is especially true in modern times, say the 20th century on. That has occurred whether the executive party controlled Congress or not. But at least two presidents are worth taking a special look at in terms of executive authority and how it compares and contrasts to what Donald Trump is doing today. And we will do just that when we get back from our second break. Be right back.
Lilac Software is proud to work with the Healthcare Labyrinth website to educate people on the healthcare system. At Lilac, we believe transparency is so important in healthcare. The healthcare system is opaque, and Lilac is trying to bring clarity to data and unleash the best member care, reduce costs, and improve outcomes. Our cloud-native payer platform revolutionizes data insights and analytics. Plans have all the data they need, but in silos locked away in point solutions. At Lilac, we solve the data fragmentation problem and help plans turn complex data into actionable insights, leading to greater operating leverage, tight cost controls, and healthier members. Health plans can improve STAR scores, reduce medical expense, drive revenue, and more. Quite simply, with Lilac, you can drive better business and health outcomes. Learn more at lilacsoftware.com.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We are talking about Donald Trump's major flexing of his muscles on executive power in the last 7 weeks or so. And we're sort of just going through what the Constitution says, what Trump has done, what Trump has argued. And we talked about the fact that presidents of both parties have sought usually to exert their executive authority. And we said we should talk about two specific examples and compare and contrast them to Donald Trump. Well, first, let's go back to almost 100 years now, not quite, but almost 100 years now, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR famously exerted his executive power at the time of the Great Depression, and at least initially, a Democratic Congress played a role in ceding a great deal of its power to him, especially via the New Deal legislation. If the executive is vested with broad foreign policy oversight in the Constitution, which it is, the FDR years solidified the executive's role over domestic and economic affairs. It also created the rise of a government bureaucracy, although FDR continually pushed back on its authority and independence. In many ways, FDR created what is known as the modern presidency. Like Trump, FDR ushered through a series of executive orders and urged Congress to pass far-reaching legislation that empowered the executive branch. It is ironic, but FDR was asserting executive power by taking on vast economic and later wartime powers to grow government, as opposed to what Trump is doing now, seeking to limit the size of government. In truth, FDR's efforts to assert executive control met with a number of defeats in court. In significant cases, the court struck his expanded New Deal authority more than it did not. FDR actually proposed some major court reforms as well because of that. They all failed, and he attacked the courts during his presidency. Sound familiar? Over time, Congress did begin to pull back on FDR's and future presidents' executive power. Another interesting feature mirroring Trump is that FDR concentrated a great deal of power within the White House and had his immediate policy aides directing a great deal of power, policy, and oversight. He stripped power from agencies, including so-called independent ones. He famously sought to remove officials as well. So let's get to our next sort of use case on executive power, and we'll talk about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon never had his party in control of any houses of Congress. As such, he often battled with Congress and therefore asserted executive power. Nixon had streamlining and efficiency as major agenda items of his administration, but Democrats controlling Congress had no inclinations to work with him. Nixon also had a dream of lessening the power of the federal bureaucracy. Nixon's expansion of executive authority came in a few ways, modeled in some ways after Eisenhower, under which he served as vice president. He also was an adherent of the unitary executive. So what did Nixon do? Well, he signed numerous executive orders each year of his presidency. He refused to spend funds that Congress appropriated. He claimed executive privilege so as not to disclose information to Congress and to stop executive agency heads from testifying before Congress. He reorganized the executive branch and unilaterally broadened the authority of new cabinet positions. He sought far-reaching authority over the Vietnam War as well. On the issue of spending funds, Nixon used what he viewed as his executive authority to impound or not spend dollars appropriated by Congress. Multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, rejected Nixon's repeated attempts to spend less than Congress had provided, and these courts ruled impoundments unallowable. In time, Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act in 1973, which clearly spelled out the process the president would have to follow if he or she were to impound funds, which spells out Congress's authority to review and approve, reject, or modify what the president has submitted. Similarly, the Line Item Veto Act of 1996, which amended the Impoundment Act, was struck by the High Court as well many years later, as it essentially delegates a legislative prerogative to the executive. Ultimately, Nixon's executive power grab came to an end with the Watergate scandal and his resignation under threat of impeachment. With that explanation of FDR and Nixon and how they compared to Trump's grab for executive power, we'll take our last break and then come back and give you a little bit on my views and what may happen on this very controversial topic. Be right back.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Mark Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Mark's insights. Twice a week, Mark publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Mark hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We are talking about Donald Trump's executive power grab here. We've gone through the Constitution and what the Constitution says, how the separation of branches and power in these branches have changed over the years. We've also given you case studies about FDR and Nixon and how their executive power grabs compares to what is going on right now with Donald Trump. So I promised you some of my dispassionate take or my views on the subject and what I believe may happen in courts and moving forward. So here are my views on the subject. I am not unsympathetic to Trump's views that the executive should have more authority over spending and policy, and that bureaucracies have been ceded or taken too much power. There also is no doubt in my mind that Congress and the executive branch have done a poor job over the last several decades of ensuring efficient use of tax dollars. This is regardless of party, in my view. So Trump's view that things need to change due to rising debt is certainly reasonable, or at least it's not unreasonable. Why should an executive be forever constrained by the poor decisions of prior presidents and Congress in terms of policy and organization and spending? Is prior precedent an excuse for the potential bankruptcy of government and the economy? That might sound a little hyperbolic, but if you check out how much debt we have outstanding, you might think it really isn't. A case can be made that the executive should have some authority to restrict spending, perhaps tied to exigencies in government. Connecticut, my state, had a closely crafted rescission authority the governor could enact tied to budget imbalances. More important, the executive is also tasked with the efficient delivery of services, which should lead to the ability for a president or governor to scrutinize spending for efficiency and legality. Indeed, in certain instances, Congress does appropriate up to certain levels, so there's another example which inherently gives the executive some discretion in terms of how much to spend. I too know as well as anyone the power of the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies, urged on by big labor and collective bargaining over the time, have created an all-powerful fourth branch of government, in my view, that sets policy and decides often which budget dollars are spent. Again, it would seem both the elected executives and legislatures' authority have truly been co-opted by federal and state agencies and bureaucracies. Reining in what Trump would call the deep state is not, again, an unreasonable expectation. The problem with what Trump is doing is all about how he goes about it, though, and what I view a bit about his excess. Is there any doubt that the DOGE Commission approach to spending freezes and examinations, as well as workforce downsizing, is way too rapid and scattershot? There is little question in my mind as well that we will see negative impacts on real services here and abroad due to the blunt force trauma approach to spending reductions and workforce reductions. Perhaps a scalpel approach is too refined. But is there a middle ground out there? Shouldn't Trump have better stated his case on government excess and teamed up with the legislative branch more, which he controls, by the way, to jointly examine reductions? Well, Trump proponents would argue he laid this all out during the campaign. But we are outside now the hyperbolic world of a political campaign, and Trump is now president and he has to govern. So I would argue he really had a duty to lay out the policy goals, work with Congress if he wanted to take these actions, and implement it in a much more rational way. While the debt is increasing each day as well, wouldn't a better strategy have been to streamline, end waste, and reconstitute the workforce for FFY 26, which begins in October, rather than implementing it way too quickly in the current FFY 2025, which actually does not even have a budget and enough funding to sustain it through the end of September? And there is also the clear perception that much of what he is doing right now is based on Trump's efforts for revenge on political opponents in the deep state. The current approaches could serve to further alienate moderates in the Republican caucuses who are already concerned about deep cuts and who Trump needs on a budget reconciliation bill if he's going to get his 2017 tax cuts extended and still limit increases in the debt. So let's talk about now what will happen or what may happen, because you can never predict these things. The congressional GOP is largely in line with Trump, while spending cuts in the budget reconciliation process may be less than desired due to moderating forces. The GOP has indeed ceded its legislative authority to Trump in many of these areas already. Much has occurred with Democrats with FDR. Congressional Democrats and states will lead the fight on Trump's desire to increase executive power and seek to limit it. As we have seen already, courts have increasingly been open to finding that executive agencies have far too much power. Recent rulings from the Supreme Court show this. One, the overturning of the long-held Chevron doctrine precedent informs this a great deal. The doctrine laid out by the Supreme Court in 1984 held that executive agencies had the reasonable ability to set policy in rules and regulations when Congress had not clearly laid out certain policy or process. A recent Supreme Court decision stated that was an unreasonable delegation back in 1984. The justice overturned the Chevron doctrine precedent by arguing that either Congress has to better prescribe policy in law or the judiciary will make such interpretations. I suspect that the court's suspicion of the executive agency or bureaucratic authority, as outlined in the overturn of the Chevron doctrine precedent, could very well mean Trump wins some issues in his battles on executive authority as they relate to the power of executive agencies and bureaucracies. On the issue of a unitary executive as well, the courts similarly have been more and more open to issues related to presidential power, empowering the executive to increasingly set policy at the expense of the bureaucracy, and to some degree the legislative branch. Trump could win here as well. The unitary argument could mean the further striking of additional statutes. This could come in areas of workforce layoffs, hiring and firing authority, and some latitude on the proper administration of government, meaning the timing and the process and the stewardship over the spending and how the executive implements it. Where Trump is likely to lose is on issues that are clearly delegated to the legislative branch. Trump is expected to push the limits of freezing spending and go for impoundment, much like Richard Nixon did. On impoundment, Trump will seek to argue that presidents historically exercised such authority, even before its striking in the Nixon era. A group of GOP lawmakers, in fact, are seeking to expunge the 1974 impoundment law, arguing it acts as a barrier to the proper exercise of inherent impoundment power by an executive. But the High Court has really spoken here already, and even a more conservative High Court is unlikely to side with Trump here, given the number of strict constructionists on the court. Thus, Trump will likely win more of his arguments to exercise broader executive power rather than less, but it will not be absolute. I think both Congress and the Supreme Court will act as checks in a number of areas, and some civil service provisions will impact decisions as well. It is also true that Trump will wait out court decisions he doesn't like and get the GOP Congress to implement his actions by budget and law anyway. This could come in the form of spending reductions, government reorganization, and workforce decisions put into a budget reconciliation bill and other laws. This would amount to the legislature reasserting its authority, but at the same time means the executive, or Trump, asserted some profound soft power to get his way. That actually sounds a lot like President Trump. With that, we'll end this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast, and we'll be back next week. Take care.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth podcast.